In her son's upscale home, a 67-year-old widow was about to serve her grandmother's mole poblano. What started as a family housewarming took a shocking turn when she came face to face with devastating humiliation. Elena Martinez wasn't your typical grieving mother. For 40 years, she had preserved 5 generations of Mexican recipes, known for dishes that connected families to their heritage. When her daughter-in-law dismissed her food as disgusting peasant food, Elena had no idea this moment would ignite a fierce determination. Her heartbreak would lead to opening a restaurant that would become a cultural phenomenon, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions start in the kitchen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Martinez's hands trembled as she adjusted the foil covering her mole poblano for the 3rd time. The ceramic dish, painted with bright yellow sunflowers, a wedding gift from 40 years ago, held 2 days of careful work. Each chocolate-tinged layer of the sauce told a story. The dried chilies she'd charred over her gas burner until the kitchen filled with smoky incense. The almonds she'd ground by hand using her grandmother's volcanic molcajete. The Mexican chocolate she'd grated while whispering the same prayer her mother had taught her. The tamales rested beside it, wrapped in corn husks she'd softened with patience and love. Inside each one, masa made from corn she'd driven 30 miles to buy from the only shop that carried the right kind, the kind that tasted like home, like the fields of Jalisco where she'd learned to cook at her abuela's side. "They'll love it, Roberto," she whispered to the empty passenger seat of her aging Honda Civic, speaking to her late husband as she often did during quiet moments. Your mole was always David's favorite. But as Elena pulled into the circular driveway of David and Stephanie's new house, all clean lines and glass windows that seemed to stare down at her like judging eyes, doubt crept in. The house spoke of success in a language Elena barely understood. Minimalist landscaping, a 3-car garage, security cameras that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. She'd dressed carefully for tonight, her best black dress, the one she wore to church on Easter, with the silver necklace Roberto had given her for their 25th anniversary. In the mirror that morning, she'd seen an elegant woman, a matriarch bringing gifts to her family. Now, climbing the stone steps with her offerings balanced carefully in her arms, she felt small. The door opened before she could ring the bell. David appeared, handsome in his pressed khakis and blue button-down, looking every inch the successful marketing executive he'd worked so hard to become. "Mama, you made it." His smile was warm but distracted, already looking past her toward the driveway where more guests were arriving. "Here, let me help with those." "Careful with the mole," Elena cautioned as he took the heavy dish. "It's still warm." Inside, the party buzzed with conversation. Elena recognized some faces. David's colleagues, a few neighbors, but most were strangers. They held wine glasses filled with something pale and expensive, picking at artfully arranged cheese boards that probably came from that gourmet shop downtown, where a single wedge cost what Elena spent on groceries for a week. "Everyone, this is my mother, Elena," David announced to a nearby cluster of guests. His voice carried pride, but Elena caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "She's brought some of her amazing homemade Mexican food." "How authentic," said a woman with perfectly highlighted hair and yoga-toned arms. "I love ethnic cuisine." Elena forced a smile, though the word ethnic sat strangely in her chest. Her food wasn't ethnic to her. It was family, memory, love stirred into every pot. Stephanie emerged from the kitchen, radiant in a white sundress that probably cost more than Elena's car payment. Her daughter-in-law had always been beautiful in that effortless way that came with good genes and better dental care, but tonight she seemed to glow with the confidence of a woman in her element. "Elena, you're here," Stephanie's voice carried across the room. "David told everyone you were bringing your traditional dishes." There was something in her tone, a microscopic pause before traditional, that made Elena's smile falter. But she pushed forward, eager to share what she'd spent 2 days perfecting. "I brought mole poblano," Elena said, following Stephanie toward the kitchen island where the food was displayed. "It's my grandmother's recipe, passed down 5 generations." And tamales with, oh. Stephanie's expression shifted as she lifted the foil from the mole dish. The rich, dark sauce, complex and earthy, with hints of chocolate and 20 different spices, looked almost black against the white ceramic. It's very dark. Other guests began to gather around, drawn by curiosity. Elena felt their eyes on her food, on her, and suddenly she was hyper-aware of how her dishes looked among the pristine appetizers and elegant canapés. Her tamales, wrapped in their corn husks, seemed rustic, primitive even. "What exactly is it?" asked the yoga woman, peering into the dish with the expression someone might wear while examining roadkill. "Mole," Elena explained, her voice growing softer. "It's a sauce with chocolate and chiles and—" "Chocolate? With meat?" The woman's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "How? Interesting." Elena's chest tightened. She looked toward David, hoping for support, for him to explain how he'd grown up loving this dish, how he used to lick the spoon when she wasn't looking. But he was engaged in conversation with his boss, deliberately not meeting her eyes. "It looks like," another guest began, then stopped himself, but not before Elena caught the amused grimace he shared with his wife. The room felt suddenly hot. Elena's hands grew damp as she watched people politely avoid her food, gravitating instead toward the safer options. The brie en croûte, the salmon pinwheels, the things that looked familiar and unthreatening. Stephanie moved closer, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a private whisper, but carried clearly in the sudden lull of conversation. "David, honey, maybe next time we should just stick to catering? Some of these smells are quite strong. And honestly, this peasant food aesthetic doesn't really match what we're going for here." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Peasant food. The phrase echoed in her mind, transforming everything she'd brought from offerings of love into sources of shame. She watched as Stephanie delicately moved her dishes to a far corner of the counter, making room for a tray of miniature quiches that had just arrived from the catering company. Elena's throat constricted. The laughter and chatter around her became white noise, overwhelming and distant at the same time. She found herself staring at her grandmother's recipe, generations of tradition, of survival, of women who had fed their families with pride and skill, reduced to an embarrassment. An inconvenience. Something to be hidden in the corner like a secret shame. Isabella, her 16-year-old granddaughter, appeared at her elbow. The girl's face was flushed with anger, her dark eyes flashing with an emotion Elena recognized as her own hurt reflected back. "Abuela," Isabella whispered urgently in Spanish, "did you hear what she said?" Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Through the crowd, she could see David laughing at something his boss had said, still avoiding her gaze. Still choosing the easy path, the safe path. The path that didn't require him to defend his mother or acknowledge the richness of where he'd come from. "I have to go," Elena managed to say, the words scraping her throat raw. "Abuela, wait." But Elena was already moving, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She made her way through the crowd, invisible now in her hurt, just another older woman to be politely ignored. At the door, she turned back once, hoping to catch David's eye, hoping for some sign that he saw her pain, that he understood what had just happened. He was raising his wine glass in a toast, his arm around Stephanie's waist, the picture of suburban success. He didn't see her leave. Outside, the cool evening air hit her flushed face like a slap. Elena fumbled with her car keys, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice on the driveway. Behind her, the party continued, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting through the perfect windows of her son's perfect house. She sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel through tears that made everything blur together. 40 years in this country. 40 years of building a life, raising children, contributing to a community that had slowly, gradually, begun to feel like home. And in one evening, In one careless comment from the woman her son loved, it had all been reduced to something shameful, something to be hidden. The drive home passed in a haze. Elena found herself pulling into her driveway without really remembering the route, muscle memory guiding her to the small house she and Roberto had bought 35 years ago. The house where she'd raised 3 children, where she'd cooked thousands of meals, where every corner held memories of the family they'd built together. Now it felt cavernous in its emptiness. Inside, the silence was deafening. Elena set her purse on the kitchen counter and looked around at the familiar space. The walls were covered with family photos. David's graduation from college, his wedding day, Isabella's quinceañera last year, pictures of birthday parties and holidays, all centered around meals Elena had prepared with love and care. On the windowsill above the sink sat her molcajed, the mortar and pestle her grandmother had given her when she married Roberto. Its volcanic stone surface was worn smooth from decades of use, seasoned with the oils of countless chilies and spices. Beside it, her collection of wooden spoons, each one bearing the scars of years of stirring and tasting. These weren't decorations or quaint ethnic artifacts. They were tools of love, instruments of nourishment, connections to generations of women who had understood that feeding someone was one of the most intimate acts of care possible. Elena sank into a kitchen chair. The same chair where she'd sat to help David with homework, where she'd taught Isabella to roll perfect tamales, where she'd planned menus for countless family gatherings. The tears came harder now, great heaving sobs that seemed to tear something loose in her chest. She thought of her grandmother, who had taught her that every dish was a prayer, every meal an offering. What would Abuela think of tonight? Of her great-great-granddaughter-in-law calling their legacy peasant food, as if the struggles and triumphs of their ancestors were something to be ashamed of. The house settled around her, creaking in the familiar way that had once brought comfort, but now felt like the sound of something breaking. Elena closed her eyes and tried to summon Roberto's voice, tried to imagine what he would say if he were here. He'd always known how to make her feel proud of who she was, where she came from. But Roberto was gone, and she was alone with the devastating realization that the family she'd devoted her life to building might not have room for the woman she truly was. Outside her kitchen window, the neighborhood slept peacefully. But for Elena Martinez, widow and keeper of family traditions, sleep would not come easily. The wound Stephanie had opened tonight went deeper than personal insult. It cut straight through to the heart of who she was and what her life had meant. And in the dark hours that stretched ahead, as she replayed every painful moment of the evening, a different kind of fire began to kindle in Elena's chest. Not the warm fire of her grandmother's kitchen, but something harder, more determined, something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding in corners and start standing in the light. The fire in Elena's chest had burned through 3 sleepless nights, fed by replayed conversations and imagined confrontations that would never come. She sat at her kitchen table in the gray light of dawn, still wearing the same black dress from the party, now wrinkled and stained with tears. The molka jade on the windowsill caught the first rays of sunlight, its ancient volcanic stone seeming to pulse with life while everything else in the house felt dead. A sharp knock at the back door made her jump. Through the frosted glass, she could see Rosa's familiar silhouette, compact and sturdy, holding what looked like a thermos and a paper bag. "Mija, open this door before I break it down," Rosa called in Spanish, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades and 30 years of friendship. Elena's hands shook as she turned the deadbolt. Rosa took one look at her and clicked her tongue in disapproval. "Dios mío, you look like death warmed over." Rosa pushed past her into the kitchen, setting down her supplies with the efficiency of a field medic. "When was the last time you ate something that didn't come from a box of tissues?" "Rosa, sit." Rosa pointed to Elena's usual chair with the same commanding gesture she'd used to raise 5 children and manage a household through decades of her husband's unpredictable construction work. "We're going to talk, but first, we're going to eat." From the paper bag emerged fresh bolillos from the Mexican bakery on Figueroa, still warm and fragrant. The thermos held café de olla, rich coffee brewed with cinnamon and brown sugar the way their mothers had taught them. Rosa moved around Elena's kitchen with familiar ease, pulling plates from cabinets, butter from the refrigerator, creating a small feast from simple ingredients. "Now," Rosa said, settling into the chair across from Elena with a grunt of satisfaction. "Tell me what that puta did to you." Despite everything, Elena felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. Rosa had never liked Stephanie, though she'd kept her opinions mostly to herself out of respect for family harmony. That diplomacy apparently had expired. "You heard? Isabella called me that night, crying so hard I could barely understand her. That girl loves you something fierce, Elena." She was ready to throw hands with her own mother over what happened. Elena tore off a piece of bread, the simple act of eating something warm and homemade steadying her somehow. "I don't want Isabella fighting with her parents because of me." "Because of you?" Rosa's voice rose an octave. "Misha, this isn't about you. This is about respect. About family. About that woman not understanding the difference between worth and price." They sat in silence for a moment, the morning light growing stronger through the kitchen windows. Elena found herself looking around the room with new eyes, really seeing it for the first time in weeks. Every surface told a story. The burn mark on the counter from when David was 12 and tried to make her breakfast in bed, the height marks on the doorframe where she'd measured all her grandchildren over the years, the collection of family photos that chronicled 40 years of birthdays, graduations, holidays. "I keep thinking about my grandmother," Elena said finally. "About how she would have handled this. Your abuela was a fierce woman. She would have burned that whole party down with her bare hands." "No," Elena shook her head. "She was smarter than that. When people disrespected her, she didn't get angry, she got strategic. She proved them wrong in ways they couldn't argue with." Rosa studied her friend's face, noting the subtle shift in posture, the way Elena's shoulders had straightened slightly. "What are you thinking, Mija?" Elena stood abruptly, walking to the kitchen window where she could see the neighborhood beginning to wake up. Mrs. Chen was tending to her garden. Mr. Williams was walking his ancient golden retriever. The young couple in the blue house was loading their baby into an expensive stroller. All of them went about their morning routines in a community that was changing around them, where small businesses were being replaced by chain stores, where families like hers were slowly being priced out by developers who saw dollar signs instead of history. "I'm thinking about that empty restaurant space on Vermont," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. "The one where Eddie's Diner used to be." Rosa nearly choked on her coffee. "The restaurant space? Elena, what are you?" "I'm thinking about showing everyone exactly what peasant food can do." The silence that followed was profound. Rosa set down her cup carefully, studying Elena's face with the intensity of someone trying to determine if her friend had lost her mind or found her purpose. "You're talking about opening a restaurant. I'm talking about opening our restaurant. A place where families can come and taste real food, where children can learn what their grandmothers knew, where," Elena's voice cracked slightly, "where traditional doesn't mean shameful." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Elena was suggesting. "Misha, do you have any idea what that would cost? The permits, the equipment, the rent?" Elena walked to the small desk in the corner where she kept her important papers. Her hands moved with sudden purpose, rifling through folders until she found what she was looking for. The envelope was thick, official-looking, bearing the logo of Roberto's life insurance company. "Roberto always said this money was for emergencies," Elena said, holding up the unopened envelope. "For when I needed to start over." She'd been avoiding opening it for 6 months, as if acknowledging the money would make Roberto's death more real. But now, in this moment, it felt like a message from him, a reminder that he'd always believed in her strength, even when she couldn't see it herself. Rosa watched as Elena carefully opened the envelope, her weathered hands surprisingly steady. The check inside was substantial, more money than Elena had ever seen in one place. Roberto had been a prudent man, a hard worker who'd believed in taking care of his family even after he was gone. "Santa Maria," Rosa breathed, catching a glimpse of the amount. "That's enough to lease the space, buy equipment, get started." Elena's voice grew stronger with each word. "Enough to show my son and his wife that there's nothing shameful about who we are or where we come from." "Elena, running a restaurant isn't like cooking for your family. The health department? the business licenses, the staff. I'll learn. Elena folded the check carefully, placing it back in the envelope. I learned to raise children in a country where I barely spoke the language. I learned to work 3 jobs while going to night school to get my GED. I learned to be a widow at 66. I can learn to run a restaurant. Rosa leaned back in her chair, studying her friend with a mixture of admiration and concern. In all their years of friendship, through job losses and family crises, through Roberto's long illness and Elena's grief, she'd never seen this particular expression on Elena's face. It was determined, yes, but also something more. It was the look of a woman who had spent 3 days in the wilderness of her own hurt and emerged with a map to somewhere entirely new. What about David? What about the family? Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. David made his choice when he stood there and said nothing, when he let his wife humiliate me in front of strangers. She paused, her voice softening slightly. I love my son, Rosa, but I won't disappear just to make his life easier. And if this fails? If you lose Roberto's insurance money? Then I'll lose it doing something that matters, something that honors him and my grandmother and everyone who came before us. Elena met Rosa's eyes directly. I'm tired of being invisible, Rosa, tired of apologizing for taking up space in my own life. Rosa reached across the table and took Elena's hands in her own. They were hands that told stories, calloused from years of hard work, marked with small scars from countless hours in the kitchen, decorated with the simple gold wedding band Elena still wore. But they were also steady, capable hands, hands that could build something new. When do we start looking at the space? Rosa asked. Elena blinked, surprised by the we. Rosa, you don't have to. Mija, you think I'm going to let you have all the fun? Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get taken advantage of by some smooth-talking landlord. Rosa grinned, and for a moment, Elena could see the young woman her friend had been, the one who'd arrived in Los Angeles with nothing but determination and a suitcase full of dreams. I've been sewing other people's clothes for 50 years. Maybe it's time I did something for myself too. They spent the next hour making lists, equipment they would need, recipes they wanted to feature, ways to make the space welcoming and authentic. Elena found herself energized by the planning, her mind racing with possibilities. A place where families could come for Sunday dinner, where teenagers like Isabella could work part-time and learn about their heritage, where the smells of real cooking could compete with the sterile efficiency of chain restaurants. We'll need a name, Rosa said, scribbling notes on the back of a grocery store receipt. Elena looked around her kitchen one more time, at the photos and memories that had sustained her through the worst night of her life since Roberto's death. Then she looked at the Mulca jade on the windowsill, at the wooden spoons hanging from hooks, at all the tools her grandmother had taught her to use with reverence and skill. Abuela's kitchen, she said without hesitation. A place where everyone's grandmother lives. Rosa nodded approvingly. Perfect. Now, finish your coffee and get dressed. We have a restaurant to go see. As Elena climbed the stairs to change clothes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, anticipation for what the day might bring. Behind her, she could hear Rosa humming while she washed their breakfast dishes, a Mexican lullaby they'd both learned from their mothers. The insurance check sat on the kitchen counter like a promise, like Roberto's final gift to help her begin again. Elena Martinez, who had spent 3 days drowning in hurt and humiliation, was about to transform into someone entirely new. Someone who would not be dismissed, ignored, or made to feel ashamed of the traditions that had shaped her. The fire in her chest had found its purpose, and it would not be easily extinguished. The keys to the empty restaurant space felt impossibly heavy in Elena's palm as she stood before the dusty glass door. Through the streaked windows, she could see the skeletal remains of Murphy's diner, scattered tables pushed against walls, a prep counter scarred by decades of chopping, and a commercial stove that looked like it had witnessed 1,000 family meals. The for-lease sign still hung in the window, though she'd signed the papers 2 hours ago with hands that shook from determination rather than fear. Rosa squeezed her shoulder. You sure about this, Meisha? Elena turned the key and pushed open the door, breathing in the smell of old grease and faded dreams. I've never been more sure of anything. The afternoon light filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across the checkerboard linoleum floor. Elena walked slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She could envision it already: warm yellow walls instead of institutional beige, hanging plants in the corners, photographs of her family's journey from Jalisco to this neighborhood. Tables where families would gather, where stories would be shared over plates of food that mattered. "The bones are good," she murmured, running her hand along the solid wood of the old counter. "It just needs love." The bell above the door chimed as someone entered. Elena turned to see a young man with kind eyes and calloused hands, wearing chef's whites that had seen better days. He looked around uncertainly, taking in the empty space and the two women standing in the middle of it. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent that reminded Elena of her own father. "I saw the lights on and thought, I heard someone might be opening a restaurant here." Elena exchanged glances with Rosa. "You heard correctly. I'm Elena Martinez." She extended her hand. "And you are?" "Miguel Santos." His handshake was firm, respectful. "I graduated from culinary school last year and I've been looking for something real. Most places want me to make fusion tacos or deconstructed this and that. I want to cook food that means something." Elena studied his face, seeing something familiar in the hunger there. Not just for a job, but for connection. For purpose. "What kind of food means something to you, Miguel?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "My abuela passed when I was 12. She never got to teach me her recipes. I've spent years trying to recreate her cochinita pibil from memory, from the smell that still lives in my dreams. But it's not the same without—" He paused, looking embarrassed. "Without the stories. Without knowing why she added the orange juice before the accioti, or why she always made the masa by hand even after she could afford a mixer." Elena felt her heart squeeze. The stories make the food taste right. Yes. Miguel's eyes lit up. Exactly. Food without stories is just fuel. Rosa nudged Elena gently. "Sounds like someone who might understand peasant food." Elena's jaw tightened at the phrase, but Miguel's reaction surprised her. Instead of confusion or dismissal, his expression grew fierce. "There's no such thing as peasant food," he said quietly. "There's only food made with love and food made without it. The techniques my grandmother used, the techniques that kept our people fed for centuries, they're not primitive. They're sophisticated in ways culinary school could never teach me." Elena stared at him for a long moment, then walked to the kitchen area. The industrial stove dominated one wall, flanked by prep counters that had seen decades of service. She traced the scratches in the metal surface, each one a testament to meals prepared with care. "Can you cook, Miguel Santos? Really cook?" "Yes, ma'am. Can you learn?" "I never stop learning." Elena nodded slowly. "Then let me tell you about my great-great-grandmother's mole poblano. And while I do, you can help me figure out how to make this place sing." Over the next 3 hours, as the afternoon light faded and Rosa went home to start her own dinner, Elena and Miguel moved through the space like dancers learning new choreography. She described each dish that would grace the menu while he took notes in a composition book, asking questions that showed he understood not just the techniques but the reverence required. "The mole needs to simmer for hours," Elena explained, gesturing toward the large stockpot she envisioned in the corner. "People today want everything fast, but some things cannot be rushed. The chocolate needs time to marry with the chilies. The spices need to whisper their secrets to each other." Miguel nodded eagerly. "My culinary instructors always talked about efficiency, about cutting corners to increase profit margins. But my grandmother used to say that shortcuts in the kitchen are shortcuts to the soul." Elena paused in her pacing. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." "She was. I just wish—" He stopped, looking down at his notebook. "I wish I could make her proud." "Miguel!" Elena waited until he looked up. She is proud. The dead don't leave us. They live in every meal we make with love, every tradition we refuse to let die. She gestured around the empty restaurant. This place will be our way of keeping them alive. They worked until well past dark, sketching layouts on napkins and discussing suppliers who might understand the importance of authentic ingredients. Miguel knew a farmer who grew heirloom corn for masa, a woman who imported real Mexican chocolate, a family that still made their own chorizo using recipes passed down through 5 generations. We'll need to be careful about portions, Miguel said practically. These ingredients cost more than the shortcuts. Elena thought of the insurance money, still sitting in her bedroom drawer. Roberto's life reduced to a number, waiting to be transformed into something meaningful. We'll make it work. Quality over quantity. Better to serve 50 people food that matters than 500 people food that doesn't. As they prepared to lock up, Miguel turned to Elena with an expression both hopeful and vulnerable. Mrs. Martinez, I need you to know. I can't pay you back right away for taking a chance on me, but I promise you won't regret this. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena looked at this young man who reminded her so much of David at that age, hungry for purpose and desperate to make his grandmother proud. Miguel, you're not taking from me. You're giving. You're giving me a chance to share what I know before it dies with me. It won't die, Miguel said firmly. Not while I'm here to learn it. Elena locked the door behind them, the keys no longer feeling heavy but full of possibility. Tomorrow they would start the real work. Scrubbing decades of other people's dreams from the walls, painting over failures to make room for hope. They would transform this hollow space into something warm and welcoming. A place where her recipes could find new life and her stories could find new voices to carry them forward. As she drove home through the familiar streets of her changing neighborhood, Elena allowed herself to imagine the first customer walking through the door. Not David or Stephanie. She wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. But someone hungry for more than just food. Someone looking for the stories that made eating into communion. The insurance money would be gone soon, invested in commercial equipment and fresh paint, and ingredients that cost more than they should. But for the first time since Roberto's funeral, Elena felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with bank accounts. She had purpose again. She had a future again. And she had Miguel, who understood that the difference between a cook and a chef wasn't training or technique. It was knowing that every meal was an act of love, and every recipe was a bridge between past and future. Tonight, she would sleep better than she had in months. Tomorrow, she would begin building her dream from scratch. Isabella scrolled through her Instagram feed with the dedication of a detective, double-tapping photos of avocado toast and artisanal coffee while her parents argued in muted voices down the hallway. Their fights had become a constant background noise since the housewarming party 3 weeks ago. A low-frequency hum of tension that made the house feel smaller somehow. She paused on a photo that made her heart skip. The image showed weathered hands kneading masa, flour-dusting dark skin that looked familiar. The caption read, "Learning from the master. Some recipes can't be rushed. #abuela's kitchen, #traditional cooking, #coming soon." Isabella's thumb froze over the screen. She recognized those hands. She'd watched them fold tamales every Christmas, seen them stir mole with the patience of prayer. But the location tag made her stomach drop. Downtown, restaurant district. She screenshot the image and dove deeper into the account. At Miguel Cooks Real had only 23 followers. But his recent post told a story that made Isabella's chest tighten with a mixture of pride and panic. Photos of her grandmother teaching knife techniques to a young chef. Elena laughing as she demonstrated how to grind spices in an ancient molcajete, the two of them standing in front of a restaurant space with paint-splattered aprons and exhausted, triumphant smiles. The most recent post was from yesterday, a video of Elena stirring a massive pot of mole while Miguel took notes. Her voice carried clearly through Isabella's phone speakers. The chocolate must be added when the chilies sing. Not before, not after. You'll know the sound when you hear it. Isabella's hands shook as she closed the app. Her grandmother was opening a restaurant. Had been planning it for weeks, apparently, while the family tore itself apart over what happened at the party. while her father drank too much wine at dinner and her mother grew increasingly defensive about comments she clearly knew had been cruel. The dinner table that evening felt like a minefield. Her father pushed food around his plate without eating. Her mother's smile was bright and brittle, and Isabella felt the weight of her discovery pressing against her ribs, like a secret too big to contain. "So," Stephanie said with forced cheer, "I was thinking we should plan another dinner party soon. Maybe do a theme? Mediterranean? Or that new plant-based place everyone's talking about could cater." David's fork scraped against his plate. "Maybe we should hold off on parties for a while." "Why? Because your mother can't handle grown-up conversation?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Isabella watched her father's face crumble, watched him open his mouth and close it again without defending his mother. Again, "She's opening a restaurant." The words tumbled out of Isabella's mouth before she could stop them. Both parents turned to stare at her, Stephanie's fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "What did you say?" David's voice was barely above a whisper. Isabella's phone felt hot in her palm. She'd meant to approach this carefully, maybe talk to her dad alone first. But watching him fail to defend her grandmother yet again had broken something open in her chest. "Abuela, she's opening a restaurant. Downtown. It's called Abuela's Kitchen." She pulled up Miguel's Instagram account and slid the phone across the table. "She's been working on it for weeks." David's face went white as he scrolled through the images. Stephanie leaned over to look, her expression shifting from confusion to something darker. "This is ridiculous," Stephanie said, her voice rising. "She's doing this out of spite, because I hurt her precious feelings at one party." "You called her food peasant food," Isabella said quietly, "in front of everyone." "I didn't." Stephanie stopped herself, her cheeks flushing. "I was making conversation. I didn't mean anything by it." "You meant exactly what you said." Isabella's voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd never spoken to her mother this way before. "And now Abuela is proving you wrong." David was still staring at the phone, his thumbs scrolling through weeks of progress he'd missed. "I can't believe she didn't tell me. We could have helped. I could have." "Could have what?" Isabella's frustration spilled over. "You didn't even defend her when Mom insulted her. Why would she trust you to help?" "Isabella Marie Martinez." Stephanie's voice cracked like a whip. "You don't speak to your parents that way." "Why not? You spoke to my grandmother that way." The silence that followed felt dangerous. David set the phone down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain that made Isabella's anger falter. "She's using the insurance money," he said quietly. "From Dad." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Her grandfather's life insurance, money that was supposed to be Elena's security, her safety net in a world without Roberto. Instead, she was investing it in a dream born from rejection and humiliation. Stephanie's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Of course she is. This is emotional blackmail, David. Can't you see that? She's trying to make us feel guilty." "Maybe we should feel guilty," David said, his voice barely audible. "For what? For having standards? For wanting to move forward instead of clinging to the past?" Isabella watched her father shrink at his wife's words, saw him retreat into the shell of conflict avoidance that had defined him for as long as she could remember. But something in his expression was different this time. Desperate. Like a man drowning who'd finally realized he needed to choose between swimming and sinking. "Those recipes," David said slowly, "they're not just food, Steph. They're who we are, where we come from. They're the past." Stephanie shot back. "And I'm not going to apologize for wanting better for our family." "Better than what? Better than your husband's heritage? Better than the woman who sacrificed everything so I could have the life I have now?" Isabella held her breath. This was the closest she'd ever seen her father come to standing up to her mother. But Stephanie wasn't backing down. "I sacrifice too, David. I work 60 hours a week. I manage this household. I network and smile and play the perfect wife so you can advance your career. And yes, I want our social circle to reflect our aspirations, not drag us backward into some romanticized version of poverty." The words hit Isabella like slaps. She thought of her grandmother's hands, worn smooth by decades of work. Of the love poured into every meal, every recipe shared like a family heirloom. How could her mother see that as poverty instead of richness? "You don't understand," Isabella said, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "You've never understood. Abuela's food isn't about being poor. It's about being connected. It's about knowing where you come from and being proud of it." Stephanie's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Isabella, sweetheart, I understand that tradition is important, but we can honor the past without being trapped by it. There are ways to celebrate your heritage that don't involve peasant food." There it was again, that phrase that had started everything. David's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. Don't say that word again." Stephanie blinked, startled by the steel in his voice. "My mother spent 2 days making that mole. 2 days. Using recipes that survived revolutions and border crossings and decades of poverty that you can't even imagine. She ground those spices by hand in a molcajete that belonged to her grandmother. And you called it peasant food like it was garbage." Isabella stared at her father, hardly recognizing this man who was finally finding his voice. "David?" "No," he held up a hand. "I should have said this 3 weeks ago. I should have said it the night it happened. My mother has never asked me for anything. Never. She worked 3 jobs to put me through college. She cleaned office buildings at night so I could have piano lessons during the day. She gave up everything, her time, her dreams, her own comfort, so I could stand in this house arguing about whether her food is good enough for our friends." Tears were streaming down Isabella's face now. This was the father she'd been waiting her whole life to meet. The son her grandmother deserved. "I failed her," David continued, his voice breaking. "I failed her completely. And now she's out there, investing Dad's life insurance money in a restaurant because her own son couldn't find the courage to defend the woman who gave him everything." Stephanie's face had gone pale. "David, I never meant—" "Yes, you did." His voice was quiet now, but certain. "You meant exactly what you said. And I let you say it because I was more worried about avoiding conflict than protecting my mother." Isabella wiped her eyes and looked between her parents. Her mother sat frozen, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of her cruelty. Her father stood with his shoulders back, transformed by the weight of speaking truth he should have voiced weeks ago. "I'm going to see her," David said, "tonight. I'm going to apologize and ask if there's any way I can help. And if she doesn't want your help?" Stephanie's voice was small now, uncertain. David met his wife's eyes. "Then I'll have to live with that. But I won't fail her again." Isabella stood up, her legs shaky but determined. "I'm coming with you." David nodded, something like pride flickering across his features. "Good. That's good." As they prepared to leave, Stephanie remained at the table, staring at the phone still displaying images of Elena's new life. For the first time since Isabella had known her, her stepmother looked truly uncertain, as if the ground beneath her perfectly ordered world had shifted without warning. "Stephanie?" David paused at the door. "You're welcome to come." She looked up at him, her expression vulnerable in a way Isabella had never seen before. "She won't want to see me." "Maybe not," David admitted. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." The drive to the restaurant passed in heavy silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Isabella pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar neighborhoods blur past. Somewhere ahead, her grandmother was probably still working, still building something beautiful from the ashes of her humiliation. Still proving that love could triumph over cruelty, that dignity could survive rejection. As they pulled up to the restaurant, Isabella could see warm lights spilling from the windows. Through the glass, Elena and Miguel moved in their choreographed dance of preparation, 2 generations united by purpose and respect. Tonight, Isabella thought as she followed her father toward the door, her family would finally have the conversation they should have had 3 weeks ago. And maybe, if they were very lucky, they might begin to heal from wounds that had festered too long in silence. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and Elena looked up from where she was stirring a pot on the stove. Her face cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope. "Mijo," she said quietly to David. "You came." Isabella watched her father's face crumple as he saw his mother truly, perhaps for the first time in years, and realized how much he had lost by choosing silence over love. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and Elena looked up from where she was stirring a pot on the stove. Her face cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope. "Mijo," she said quietly to David. "You came." Isabella watched her father's face crumble as he saw his mother truly, perhaps for the first time in years, and realized how much he had lost by choosing silence over love. 3 weeks had passed since that confrontation in Elena's restaurant kitchen. 3 weeks of careful conversations, tentative forgiveness, and David's desperate attempts to rebuild a bridge he'd let crumble. Elena had listened to his apologies with the patience of a woman who'd spent decades learning to love imperfect people, but Isabella could see the wariness in her grandmother's eyes. Trust, once broken, required more than words to mend. Now, on opening night of Abuela's kitchen, that fragile piece would face its first real test. Elena stood in her restaurant kitchen at 5 in the morning, her hands steady as she ground spices for the mole that would simmer all day. The familiar ritual calmed her nerves. The volcanic stone of her molkajit worn smooth by generations of women, the sound of grinding that carried the rhythm of prayer. Miguel worked beside her in comfortable silence, prepping vegetables with the precision she'd taught him over endless hours of practice. "You ready for this, Abuela?" Miguel asked, using the title that had evolved naturally between them over the past month. Elena paused in her grinding, considering the question seriously. The restaurant gleamed around them. Warm yellow walls lined with photographs of her family's journey from Jalisco to Los Angeles. Tables set with colorful linens and mason jar glasses filled with fresh marigolds. Every detail reflected her vision of home, of the kind of place where stories were shared over plates of food that mattered. "I don't know if anyone's ever ready to put their heart on display," she said finally. "But we're as prepared as we can be." Rosa arrived at 6:30 with a thermos of coffee and nervous energy that matched Elena's own. She'd appointed herself unofficial hostess, claiming that someone needed to make sure Elena didn't hide in the kitchen all night. "How many reservations?" Rosa asked, tying an apron over her best dress. 12 tables for dinner service. Miguel thinks we should have taken more, but you want to do it right, not fast," Rosa finished. "Smart. Better to have 12 people leave happy than 24 leave disappointed." By 4 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered outside the restaurant windows. Elena peered through the kitchen service window, her stomach fluttering as she recognized neighbors from the old days mixed with young couples drawn by the Instagram posts Isabella had been sharing with increasing frequency. Isabella herself arrived at 4:30, her camera bag slung over her shoulder and her eyes bright with excitement that felt like absolution to Elena's bruised heart. "Abuela, you look beautiful," Isabella said, admiring Elena's embroidered blouse, one she'd worn to her own wedding 45 years ago. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Elena admitted. "What if they don't understand? What if the food isn't?" "Stop." Isabella took her grandmother's hands. "The food is perfect. You're perfect. And anyone who doesn't appreciate what you're doing here doesn't deserve to eat your cooking anyway." Elena squeezed her granddaughter's fingers, drawing strength from Isabella's fierce loyalty. At least one person in her family truly saw her. David arrived alone at 5:15, carrying a bouquet of marigolds and wearing an expression of nervous hope. Elena met him at the door, accepting the flowers with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Where's Stephanie?" Elena asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. She said she wasn't feeling well." David's voice carried the weight of a man making excuses he didn't believe. "But she wanted me to give you this." He handed Elena a small card. Inside, Stephanie's careful handwriting read, "Wishing you success tonight. I hope you find what you're looking for." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't cruelty either. Elena tucked the card into her apron pocket, choosing to interpret it as progress rather than dismissal. At 6 o'clock sharp, Elena unlocked the front door. The first customers were the Rodriguezes, an elderly couple who remembered when this block was filled with Mexican families before gentrification began its slow erasure. They ordered in Spanish and smiled when Elena responded in kind, their faces lighting up at flavors that tasted like memory. By 7, every table was full. Elena moved between kitchen and dining room, her initial nervousness transforming into something like joy as she watched people's faces change with their first taste of her mole. Conversations flowed in English and Spanish, punctuated by the kind of laughter that comes from unexpected discovery. A young woman at table 6 closed her eyes after her first spoonful of pozole, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This tastes like my grandmother's," she whispered to her boyfriend. "I haven't had pozole like this since she died." Elena felt her own eyes burn. This was why she'd risked everything. For moments like this, when food became bridge between past and present, when recipes carried not just flavor, but love across generations, Miguel worked with quiet intensity, plating each dish with the reverence Elena had taught him. The kitchen moved like a well-rehearsed dance, 2 generations united in purpose and precision. At 8:30, the bell chimed again, and Elena looked up to see a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a notebook, surveying the room with professional assessment. Isabella nudged Elena's arm. "That's Carmen Rodriguez," Isabella whispered, "the food critic from the Times. She must have seen my posts." Elena's stomach dropped. She remembered Carmen from David's graduation, remembered her as successful but somehow distant from her own heritage. What would a woman like that make of this humble neighborhood restaurant? Carmen chose a corner table and ordered methodically the mole poblano, street corn, tamales, and horchata. Elena watched from the kitchen as the critic photographed each dish, tasted carefully, made notes. Her expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away. But then Carmen tried the mole. Elena saw the moment it happened, the slight widening of eyes, the pause as flavor registered not just on palate but in memory. Carmen set down her fork and simply sat for a moment, her professional mask slipping to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. Elena couldn't resist. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached the table. "How is everything?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Carmen looked up, and Elena was surprised to see moisture in the critic's eyes. "This mole," Carmen said quietly. "It tastes like coming home to a place I'd forgotten existed. It's my great-great-grandmother's recipe, from Jalisco." "Mine too," Carmen said with a small smile. "Well, my family's from Michoacan, but the technique, the love, it's the same." She gestured to her nearly empty plate. "I haven't tasted anything this authentic since my own abuela passed." Elena felt her chest loosen. "Would you like to hear the story of the recipe?" Carmen's professional demeanor softened completely. "I would love that." For the next 20 minutes, Elena shared the history woven into her mole. The chocolate brought by trade routes, the chilies that grew in volcanic soil, the techniques passed down through women who preserved culture in their kitchens when the world outside tried to erase them. Carmen listened with the attention of someone hungry for more than food. As the evening wound down and the last customers lingered over dessert, Elena stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a successful service. Miguel cleaned with the systematic efficiency she'd taught him, while Rosa counted receipts with satisfaction. David approached the kitchen window, his face soft with something Elena hadn't seen in years. Pride. Not the careful, qualified pride of professional achievement, but the deep, uncomplicated pride of a son who finally understood what his mother had built. "Mom," he said quietly, "this is incredible. The food, the atmosphere, the way people are responding. You've created something special here." Elena wiped her hands on her towel, studying her son's face. "Did you eat?" "Every bite." And I remembered. His voice caught slightly. "I remembered being 8 years old, standing on that step stool in our kitchen, learning to stir the chocolate into the mole. I remembered feeling proud to be your son. You were always my pride, Mijo, even when you forgot where you came from. David nodded, tears threatening. I won't forget again. As Elena locked the door behind the last customer, she felt the weight of the evening settle over her like a blessing. The restaurant had found its heartbeat on this first night, the rhythm of stories shared over food, of tradition honored and evolved, of community built around tables where everyone was welcome. Carmen Rodriguez had left with promises to return, her notebook full of observations that felt more like love letters than reviews. Isabella's camera had captured moments of joy that would live forever in digital memory. David had rediscovered pride in his heritage. And Elena had proven to herself that her recipes, her stories, her very identity had value that transcended one cruel woman's dismissal. Tonight, Abuela's kitchen had officially opened. But more than that, Elena Martinez had officially reclaimed her voice. Elena woke at 4:30 in the morning, her body automatically responding to the rhythm she'd established over the past 3 weeks since opening. The restaurant had settled into a comfortable routine. Steady neighborhood clientele, word-of-mouth recommendations bringing new faces each week, and the deep satisfaction that came from watching people discover the stories hidden in her family recipes. She padded to the kitchen in her slippers, making coffee in the French press David had given her last Christmas, a gift she'd barely used until now. As the coffee steeped, she checked her phone for any messages from Miguel about the day's prep schedule. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages. Her Instagram notifications showed numbers she'd never seen before. Elena's hands trembled as she opened the first message, from Rosa. Mija, are you seeing this? Call me now. The second was from Isabella, sent at midnight. Abuela, you're famous. Carmen's review is everywhere. Elena's coffee grew cold as she fumbled through the messages, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finally, she found the link Isabella had shared, an article in the Los Angeles Times food section with the headline, Abuela's Kitchen, where recipes become revolution. Carmen Rodriguez's review read like a love letter to everything Elena had poured into the restaurant. But it was more than just praise for the food. It was a meditation on identity, belonging, and the profound act of cultural preservation that happened every time Elena ground spices in her molcajit. Elena Martinez didn't set out to start a revolution when she opened Abuela's Kitchen 3 weeks ago. She simply wanted to honor the recipes that have sustained her family for 5 generations. But in a city where authentic Mexican food too often means fusion concepts dreamed up in corporate boardrooms, Martinez's tiny restaurant feels like an act of resistance. Elena's eyes filled as she continued reading. Carmen had captured not just the flavors, but the intention behind every dish. The way Elena shared stories with each plate, the reverence Miguel showed for traditional techniques. The mole poblano here isn't just exceptional, it's transformative. Martinez's great-great-grandmother's recipe creates layers of complexity that speak to centuries of culinary evolution, each spice whispering secrets that chain restaurants have never learned. But more than the food itself, it's Martinez's generous spirit that makes Abuela's Kitchen special. She doesn't just serve meals, she serves memory, identity, and love. The review had been shared 8,000 times on Twitter. Food blogs had picked it up. Even national food magazines were reposting excerpts. Elena's phone rang, making her jump. David's name appeared on the screen. Mom? Are you okay? I've been trying to call you for an hour. I just woke up. Elena sank into her kitchen chair, still staring at the screen. David, what is happening? You're famous, Mom. Carmen's review went viral. There are already people lining up outside the restaurant, and Miguel says the reservation phone has been ringing since 6 a.m. Elena felt the world tilt slightly. People are lining up? I'm heading over there now to help Miguel. Rosa's already there. Apparently she hasn't slept either. Mom, this is incredible. The whole city is talking about Abuela's Kitchen. When Elena arrived at the restaurant an hour later, she found a line stretching around the block. Young couples held steaming coffee cups while checking their phones. Food bloggers live-streamed their wait. A local news van was parked across the street. Inside, Rosa, Miguel, and David worked in controlled chaos, trying to manage a reservation system that had gone from manageable to overwhelming overnight. The phone rang constantly, and Miguel's Instagram account, the humble at Miguel Cooks Real that Isabella had discovered, now had 15,000 new followers. Elena! Rosa rushed over, her eyes bright with excitement and panic. Mija, we have a problem. A good problem, but still a problem. I've got reservation requests for the next 3 months. And that's just from this morning's calls. Elena looked through the window at the crowd outside, feeling simultaneously thrilled and terrified. This was beyond her wildest dreams, and also beyond her capacity to manage. Miguel appeared at her elbow, his chef's whites already stained with prep work. Abuela, we need to talk about supply. Our usual vendors can't handle the volume we're going to need. And I hate to say it, but we might need help in the kitchen. Elena nodded slowly, trying to process the magnitude of change crashing over her quiet neighborhood restaurant. What do you suggest? Well, Miguel said carefully, we could limit service, keep the same number of tables, maybe add a second seating, maintain quality over quantity. Through the window, Elena watched a young woman take a selfie in front of the restaurant sign, her face bright with anticipation. Behind her, an elderly man read Carmen's review aloud to his wife in Spanish, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. They came because they're hungry for something real, Elena murmured. How can we turn them away? David approached, his phone still buzzing with notifications. Mom, I've had 3 calls this morning from production companies wanting to feature you on cooking shows. Food Network wants to discuss a potential series. There's a publisher interested in a cookbook deal. Elena stared at her son. A cookbook? Your recipes, your stories. They want to capture what Carmen wrote about. The way you preserve culture through food. The magnitude of it all pressed against Elena's chest. She thought of Roberto's insurance money, invested in equipment and dreams. Now those dreams were growing beyond anything she'd imagined, sprouting possibilities she couldn't have conceived when she first stirred that bitter pain into determination. Isabella burst through the back door, her camera bag bouncing against her hip and her face flushed with excitement. Abuela, did you see? The Food Network posted about you on their Instagram, and there's a TikTok video of someone eating your mole that has 50,000 views already. Elena felt dizzy. Isabella, slow down. What does this all mean? It means, Isabella said, taking her grandmother's hands, that everyone finally sees what I've always known. That your food isn't just food. It's art, it's history, it's love made visible. Elena's eyes filled. 3 months ago, she'd been invisible at her own son's party, her lifetime of knowledge dismissed as peasant food. Now strangers waited hours for the privilege of tasting her recipes, but the weight of success felt heavier than she'd expected. The quiet intimacy she'd created, the space where stories were shared over perfect plates of mole, threatened to disappear under the pressure of viral fame. Miguel seemed to read her thoughts. We don't have to change everything, Abuela. We can grow carefully, thoughtfully. Keep the heart of what we've built while sharing it with more people. Rosa squeezed Elena's shoulder. Mija, you've spent 40 years being invisible. Don't let fear make you disappear again just when the world is finally seeing you. Elena looked around at the people who'd become her chosen family. Miguel with his fierce loyalty to tradition, David finally understanding the value of his heritage, Isabella documenting their journey with the passion of a true believer, Rosa providing the steady wisdom that kept her grounded. Outside, the line of hopeful customers grew longer, each person carrying their own hunger for authenticity in a world of artificial flavor. Elena straightened her shoulders and tied her apron with deliberate precision. Miguel, call our suppliers. See who can handle increased orders without compromising quality. Rosa, start a waiting list for next month's reservations. David, she paused, meeting her son's eyes. Help me figure out how to do this right. As the day progressed, Elena moved between kitchen and dining room, greeting customers who'd driven across the city for a taste of her mole. She shared stories of her great-great-grandmother, explained the significance of each ingredient, watched faces transform with understanding and memory. By evening, she was exhausted, but exhilarated. The restaurant had served more people in one day than in its first 2 weeks combined, yet somehow the intimate atmosphere had survived. Stories were still shared, connections still made, recipes still honored. As Elena locked the door after the last customer, she realized that viral success hadn't diminished her original vision. It had amplified it. Her small act of defiance had become something larger, proof that authenticity could triumph over artificiality, that traditional knowledge had value in a modern world, that one woman's refusal to be silenced could inspire others to find their own voices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, corporate offers to consider, media requests to navigate, the delicate balance between growth and authenticity to maintain. But tonight, Elena Martinez went to sleep, knowing she'd done something remarkable. She'd taken her pain and transformed it into joy that fed not just bodies, but souls. The man in the expensive suit looked out of place among the marigolds and family photographs that lined the walls of Abuela's kitchen. Richard Brennan from Culinary Concepts, Inc. had arrived precisely at 9 a.m., with a briefcase full of contracts and dreams that glittered like fool's gold. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, spreading documents across Elena's favorite corner table, "what we're offering here is generational wealth. 15 locations across California in the first year, with expansion to Texas and Arizona by year 3. Your recipes, your brand, your story, but with the infrastructure to reach millions of people instead of hundreds." Elena studied the numbers on the contract. More money than Roberto's entire lifetime of earnings. More money than David made in 5 years. Enough to secure not just her future but Isabella's college education, David's mortgage, even a trust fund for grandchildren not yet born. Miguel stood behind the counter, pretending to prep vegetables while obviously listening to every word. His knife work had grown increasingly agitated as Brennan outlined his vision: standardized portion sizes, pre-made mole bases shipped from a central facility, cost-cutting measures that would maximize profit margins. "The beauty of your concept," Brennan continued, "is its scalability. We've already identified the key flavor profiles that make your mole so appealing. Our food scientists can replicate them using more efficient ingredients while maintaining that authentic taste your customers love." Elena's molcajete sat on the counter nearby, its volcanic stone surface worn smooth by 5 generations of women. She thought of her great-great-grandmother grinding spices by hand in a village kitchen, adding ingredients by feel and instinct, adjusting flavors based on the humidity in the air, the ripeness of the chilies, the whispered advice of ancestors who lived on in every dish. "Mr. Brennan," Elena said carefully, "when you say replicate, what exactly do you mean?" "Well, for instance, the chocolate you use, it's imported, expensive, inconsistent in quality. We can substitute a standardized cocoa product that delivers the same basic flavor profile at a fraction of the cost. The customers will never know the difference." Miguel's knife paused mid-chop. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And the molcajete grinding?" Brennan laughed. "Completely unnecessary from an efficiency standpoint. Industrial spice grinders can process larger quantities in a fraction of the time. We'd keep one molcajete in each location for show. Let customers see the traditional preparation, but the actual spice grinding would happen at our central facility." Elena looked at her hands, calloused from decades of grinding corn, stirring sauces, kneading masa. These hands that had learned their craft from watching her mother, who had learned from watching her mother. Hands that could feel when Mole needed more chocolate, more time, more love. "What about the stories?" Elena asked. "The history behind each recipe?" "That's the brilliant part." Brennan's eyes lit up. "We'll develop a standardized narrative for each location. Train the servers to deliver key talking points about tradition and authenticity. Maybe even record you telling some of the stories and play them on loop in the dining rooms. Customers get the authentic experience without the unpredictability of actual storytelling." Elena felt as if she were watching her life being dissected by someone who understood the monetary value of each piece but missed the soul that connected them all. The door chimed as David entered, fresh from his morning run and checking his phone. He'd been fielding calls from other corporate representatives all week, franchise opportunities, licensing deals, investment offers that promised to transform Elena's small restaurant into a national brand. "Mom, sorry I'm late. How's the presentation going?" Brennan immediately stood to shake David's hand. "Mr. Martinez, I was just explaining to your mother how we can take Abuela's Kitchen from a local success to a cultural phenomenon. With the right backing, she could become the next Chipotle, but authentic." Elena watched her son's face as Brennan repeated his pitch, saw the careful consideration in David's expression. Her successful marketing executive's son understood numbers, projections, market penetration strategies. He could probably see the wisdom in Brennan's approach from a business perspective. But Elena also saw something else in David's eyes. A flicker of unease when Brennan mentioned replacing handmade elements with industrial alternatives, when he described turning her stories into recorded soundbites. "It's certainly an impressive offer," David said diplomatically. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "We'd want to move quickly while the momentum from that Times review is still hot. First location could be open within 6 months. We already have sites identified in Santa Monica and Beverly Hills." Elena's chest tightened. Santa Monica and Beverly Hills, where her food would be served to people who ordered it because it was trendy rather than meaningful, where servers who'd never heard of Jalisco would recite scripted stories about traditions they didn't understand. Miguel finally couldn't stay silent. "And the ingredients? The techniques that take years to master?" Brennan turned to him with the patronizing smile of someone addressing a child. "You must be the head chef. Don't worry, there would absolutely be a place for you in our expansion plan. We'd need someone to oversee quality control at the central facility." "Quality control," Miguel repeated slowly, "for pre-made mole base." "Exactly. You'd ensure consistency across all locations. No more guesswork, no more variations. Every customer gets exactly the same experience whether they're in Los Angeles or Phoenix." Elena closed her eyes and could hear Rosa's voice from the night before. "Mija, you didn't build this place to get rich. You built it to keep your family's soul alive." When she opened her eyes, both men were looking at her expectantly. David's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. The son who wanted financial security for his mother warring with the man who was finally learning to value his heritage. "Mr. Brennan," Elena said slowly, "I need some time to consider your offer." Of course. But I should mention, we have other opportunities we're evaluating. Mexican cuisine is very hot right now, and we'd hate for you to miss this window of opportunity." After Brennan left, promising to call in a few days, Elena sat in the quiet restaurant with David and Miguel. The lunch prep waited unfinished on the counter, but none of them moved to continue it. "Mom," David said carefully, "I know this is a big decision. But that's serious money. Life-changing money." "Would it change my life for the better?" Elena asked. "Or would it just change it?" Miguel spoke up quietly. "My culinary school friends work for places like that. They follow recipes created in corporate test kitchens, use pre-made sauces, heat and serve. They make good money, but they're not really cooking. They're assembling." David frowned. "But think about the reach, Miguel. Thousands of people who would never come to this neighborhood could experience Mom's food. Isn't that worth something?" "Experience what, though?" Elena asked. "My food, or a corporate interpretation of my food." She walked to the molcajete and picked up the pestle, feeling its familiar weight. "When I grind these spices, I'm not just preparing ingredients. I'm continuing a conversation that started with my great-great-grandmother. Every motion my hands make, she made. Every adjustment I make to the seasoning, she taught my mother, who taught me." Elena began grinding cumin, the aromatic oils releasing into the air. "If I let them turn this into a factory process, that conversation ends. My great-great-grandmother's hands become meaningless. The struggle to preserve these recipes through poverty and immigration and discrimination, all of that becomes just a marketing story." David was quiet for a long moment. "So you're saying no?" Elena continued grinding, letting the rhythm steady her thoughts. I'm saying that success isn't just about money, Mijo. It's about staying true to why you started something in the first place. But Mom, you could secure your future. Never worry about money again. Elena set down the pestle and looked at her son, this man she'd sacrificed everything to educate, whose success had always been her greatest pride. David, I've been poor before. I've worked 3 jobs and still struggled to pay rent. You know what I've never been? David shook his head. I've never been untrue to who I am. And I'm not going to start now, even for $15 million. Miguel's smile was brilliant. David's expression was more complex. Pride mixed with worry, understanding tempered by practical concerns. The door chimed as Rosa entered, carrying groceries for the evening's prep. She took one look at their faces and set down her bags. They made the offer? She asked. Elena nodded. $15 million to turn Abuela's kitchen into a chain restaurant. Rosa was quiet for a moment, then walked to the counter and began unpacking vegetables. Well, she said finally, I guess the question is, do you want to be rich or do you want to be Elena Martinez? Elena looked around her restaurant, at the photographs of her family's journey, at the molcajete that had traveled from Jalisco to Los Angeles, at Miguel, who had become the grandson she'd always dreamed of, at David, who was slowly learning to value the things that mattered most. I want to be Elena Martinez, she said. And Elena Martinez doesn't sell her soul, no matter how good the price. The molcajete felt foreign in Stephanie's hands, heavier than she'd expected, its volcanic stone surface rough against her palms. Elena stood beside her, patient as a saint, guiding her through the ancient rhythm of grinding spices. The cumin released its earthy fragrance as Stephanie worked, filling the kitchen with a scent that spoke of traditions she'd never known. Slower, Elena murmured. Feel the stone. It's been grinding spices for 60 years, longer than you've been alive. It knows what it's doing, even if you don't. Stephanie's arms ached, but she continued the motion. Each turn of the pestle felt like penance, like a prayer she was finally learning to speak. David watched from nearby, his expression cycling between amazement and something that looked like relief. My foster families, Stephanie said quietly, not breaking rhythm, they always served food from boxes. Processed, convenient, quick. I learned to see that as normal, as better somehow. More civilized. Elena nodded without judgment. Food from boxes feeds the body, but it doesn't feed anything else. The afternoon light filtered through the restaurant windows, casting long shadows across the dining room. Rosa had quietly left to run errands, and Miguel worked in the back kitchen, giving them privacy while staying close enough to help if needed. When I was 12, Stephanie continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I was placed with a Mexican family. The Hernandez family. They tried so hard to make me feel welcome. Elena's hands stilled on the counter. What happened? Stephanie's grinding became more erratic, her emotions affecting her rhythm. Mrs. Hernandez made this incredible pozole for my first dinner with them. She spent all day cooking it, telling me stories about her grandmother's recipe. It smelled amazing, looked beautiful, but Stephanie's voice cracked. I refused to eat it. Said it looked weird, that I wasn't hungry. Elena gently placed her hands over Stephanie's, steadying the pestle. Why? Because the other kids at school had already started calling me a foster kid. They knew I didn't belong anywhere. And I was terrified that if I ate Mexican food, if I seemed too comfortable with it, they'd have more ammunition to use against me. More ways to mark me as different, as other. Tears dripped onto the ground cumin. Mrs. Hernandez's face when I rejected her food. She looked so hurt, like I'd slapped her. And Mr. Hernandez got this closed-off expression, like he was protecting himself from me. They never tried to cook special meals for me again. Elena felt her chest tighten. She could picture this scared 12-year-old girl armoring herself with rejection rather than risk vulnerability. How long did you stay with them? 6 months. They were kind, but I could tell I'd broken something that first night. I never let them in after that, never gave them a chance to love me properly. When I was moved to another family, Mrs. Hernandez packed my things in silence. She didn't even say goodbye. Elena guided Stephanie's hands back to the proper grinding motion. What was her name, her first name? Carmen. Carmen Hernandez. Stephanie paused, looking up at Elena. Why? Elena smiled sadly. Because when you learn to make this mole properly, you'll be honoring her memory too. Every time you grind these spices with love instead of fear, you'll be giving her the respect you couldn't give as a frightened child. Fresh tears tracked down Stephanie's cheeks. I don't deserve that kind of forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Mija, it's about healing. Elena took the pestle from Stephanie's trembling hands. But first, let me teach you something about mole that most people never learn. Elena began grinding again, her movements sure and practiced. People think mole is about the chocolate, or the chilies, or the 30 different ingredients. But those are just the surface. The real secret is that mole can't be made properly by someone who's running away from themselves. She paused, meeting Stephanie's eyes. The grinding, the stirring, the tasting and adjusting, it requires you to be present, to be honest about what you're bringing to the pot. Fear makes mole bitter. Anger makes it harsh. But love makes it sing. David cleared his throat. Mom, I need to say something too. Both women turned to him. Elena saw her son struggle with words. His executive polish stripped away to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. When Stephanie said those things at the party, David began, part of me was relieved. Elena blinked in surprise. Relieved? Because it gave me an excuse to avoid choosing sides. I could tell myself that you were both being dramatic, that it would blow over if I just stayed neutral. David's voice grew thick with shame. But the truth is, I'd been pulling away from our traditions for years, not because I was ashamed of them, but because I was afraid they made me less successful. Elena set down the pestle completely now, giving her son her full attention. At work, at networking events, in our neighborhood, I started presenting myself as just American, not Mexican American, just American. I stopped mentioning that my mother was an immigrant. I never talked about growing up bilingual, about the foods I learned to cook at your side. David's hands clenched into fists. I thought it would make me more palatable, more promotable. David, Elena's voice was soft with understanding. When Stephanie called your food peasant food, it was awful, but it was also exactly what I'd been afraid other people thought. And instead of defending you, instead of standing up for everything you'd taught me, I froze, because part of me wondered if she was right. The silence that followed felt heavy with generations of pain, the particular ache of children who leave their parents, whirled behind in search of acceptance, only to discover they've lost something irreplaceable. Stephanie reached for David's hand. We were both running from different things, but we ended up in the same place, afraid to be authentic. Elena looked at these two people, her son and daughter-in-law, both successful by every external measure, both carrying wounds that had shaped them in ways she'd never fully understood. Come here, she said simply. They approached uncertainly. Elena guided Stephanie's hands back to the molkajis, then placed David's hands over hers, her own covering them both. This is how my mother taught me, Elena said, and how her mother taught her. Not just the technique, but the trust, the willingness to let someone guide your hands until you find your own rhythm. Together, they ground the cumin, 3 generations of hands moving in unison. Elena felt the tension leave Stephanie's shoulders, saw David's face soften as muscle memory from childhood returned. The mole isn't the only thing that needs healing, Elena said. We all have work to do. Miguel appeared from the kitchen, drawn by the sound of conversation. He stopped when he saw the 3 of them working together, a smile spreading across his face. Miguel, Elena called, come teach them about the chiles. They need to understand the different types of heat. As Miguel began explaining the subtle differences between ancho and mulatto chiles, Elena watched her family begin to transform. Stephanie asked thoughtful questions, genuinely curious about techniques she'd dismissed weeks earlier. David volunteered memories of helping Elena cook when he was young, stories that made Stephanie smile instead of tense. The afternoon melted into evening as they worked side by side, building the complex layers of flavor that would become mole poblano. Elena found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years. About her mother's journey from Mexico. About Roberto's first attempts to court her with clumsy Spanish. About the day David was born and how she'd made pozole to celebrate because it was the first food she'd craved after giving birth. Why pozole? Stephanie asked. Because it's a celebration food. Ceremonial. In ancient times, it was made for the most important occasions. Elena stirred the slowly developing mole, tasting and adjusting. When David was born, I wanted to honor the magnitude of the moment. The way his arrival changed everything, the way he connected our past to our future. Stephanie was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Hernandez made pozole for me because she understood that too. She was trying to tell me I was important, that my arrival mattered. Yes, Elena said simply. That's exactly what she was doing. As the mole reached its final stages, simmering with the deep complexity that only came from hours of patient attention, Elena felt something shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. The space that had been born from hurt and defiance was transforming into something warmer, more complete. Elena, Stephanie said as they prepared to taste the finished sauce, I have something else to confess. Elena raised an eyebrow, ladling mole into small bowls for tasting. After the party, after I said those terrible things, I went home and looked up your family's story online. I found old newspaper articles about your immigration, about Roberto's work, about the struggles you faced building a life here. Stephanie's voice grew thoughtful. I realized that everything I'd been trying so hard to achieve, respectability, acceptance, security, you'd already built, but you'd done it without abandoning who you were. You'd never hidden your accent or apologized for your heritage or pretended to be anything other than Elena Martinez from Jalisco. Elena handed her a spoon. Taste. Stephanie dipped the spoon into the mole, brought it to her lips, and closed her eyes. The complexity of flavors unfolded on her tongue: chocolate and chilies, cinnamon and cloves, the earthiness of ground cumin and the brightness of tomatoes. But beneath all of that was something else, something that couldn't be replicated in any corporate kitchen. It tastes like… Stephanie paused, searching for words. Like home. Like the kind of home I always wanted but never knew how to create. David tasted next, his eyes closing as childhood memories flooded back. This is exactly how I remember it. Exactly. Miguel nodded approvingly. Perfect balance. The chocolate sings with the chilies instead of competing. Elena tasted last, her experienced palate analyzing each component while her heart registered something more important. The love that had gone into every step, the healing that had happened over the pot. It's good, she said simply. But more than that, it's honest. It tastes like truth. As they cleaned up the kitchen together, moving in the easy choreography of people who'd shared meaningful work, Elena felt a peace she hadn't experienced since Roberto's death. Her restaurant was no longer just her sanctuary. It was becoming a place where her family could rebuild itself. There's something I want to ask you, Elena said as they finished wiping down the counters. Both of you. David and Stephanie looked up expectantly. I've decided not to sell to the corporation. This restaurant stays small, stays authentic. But that means I need help, real help, to manage the growth we're experiencing. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. David, your marketing skills could help us reach people who need this kind of food, this kind of community. And Stephanie, your organizational abilities could help us serve them properly without losing our soul. David's eyes widened. You want us to work here? I want us to work together. As a family, if you're willing. Stephanie looked around the restaurant, seeing it with new eyes. The warm colors, the family photographs, the molkajit that had traveled across borders and through time. It all felt like the home she'd been searching for her entire life. I'd be honored, Stephanie said. But I don't know anything about restaurants. Elena smiled. You know about organization. You know about presentation. And now you're learning about mole. That's enough to start with. David nodded slowly. I could take a leave of absence from the firm, help you develop a sustainable business plan that grows carefully instead of just quickly. And, Stephanie added, her voice growing stronger, I could help train servers to share the stories properly, not scripted corporate versions, but real understanding of what each dish means. Elena felt tears threaten. You would do that? Elena, Stephanie said, using her mother-in-law's first name for the first time without it feeling awkward. You've given me something I've been looking for my whole life. A sense of belonging, of being part of something meaningful. Of course I'll help protect it. Miguel cleared his throat. If we're making family business decisions, I have something to suggest too. They all turned to him. Cooking classes, not just for customers, but for families like yours. Families where traditions got lost or broken. Places where people can come together and heal over food. Elena's eyes lit up. Families where the children have moved away from their heritage and want to find their way back. Exactly. We could offer different series. Mother-daughter classes, father-son classes. Even classes for people who want to connect with cultures that aren't their own, but that they want to honor properly. Stephanie's marketing mind was already spinning. We could partner with community centers, with schools. Create scholarships for families who couldn't otherwise afford it. David nodded enthusiastically. And document the stories that emerge. Create a cookbook that's not just recipes, but healing narratives. Elena looked around at these three people. Her son finding his way back to his roots, her daughter-in-law discovering roots she'd never had, her chosen grandson building bridges between past and future. The restaurant that had begun as an act of defiance was becoming something much more powerful. A place of connection, healing, and hope. Then that's what we'll do, Elena said. We'll keep Abuela's kitchen small enough to matter, big enough to heal, and authentic enough to honor everyone who came before us. As they locked up the restaurant that evening, Elena felt Roberto's presence in the warm breeze that rustled the marigolds in their window boxes. He would have loved this. Watching their family find its way back to each other, watching his grandson Miguel become part of their story, watching love triumph over fear in the most ordinary and extraordinary of ways. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new opportunities to share their story. But tonight, Elena Martinez went home knowing she'd done something remarkable. She'd taken the bitter taste of rejection and transformed it into the sweet possibility of redemption. Not just for herself, but for everyone willing to gather around her table, with open hearts and hungry souls. 2 weeks after the mole lesson that had changed everything, Elena stood in her restaurant kitchen before dawn, preparing for a meal that would either heal her family completely or reveal how much work they still had to do. Today was the soft launch of their first family cooking class, and the test family would be the most challenging possible, her own. Isabella had spent the previous evening setting up cameras and lighting equipment throughout the kitchen, documenting what she called Abuela's grand experiment in radical healing. Her granddaughter's social media following had grown to nearly 50,000 people, all hungry for authentic stories about food, family, and forgiveness. Are you ready for this? Miguel asked, tying his apron with the ceremonial precision he'd developed for important occasions. Elena checked the prep stations one final time. Molcajetes at each workstation, ingredients measured and arranged in the order they'd be used, copies of her grandmother's handwritten recipe cards translated into English. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. The corporate offers had stopped coming after word spread that Elena Martinez wasn't interested in franchising her soul. Instead, she'd received inquiries from cooking schools, culinary historians, and families who'd heard about the healing that was happening at Abuela's kitchen. The waiting list for the family classes already stretched 3 months. David arrived first, carrying a nervous energy that reminded Elena of his childhood piano recitals. Behind him came Stephanie, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing an apron she'd purchased specifically for this occasion, embroidered with marigolds, a conscious choice to honor the culture she'd once rejected. Where do you want us? David asked, his marketing executive confidence replaced by the humility of a student. Anywhere you feel comfortable, Elena replied. This isn't about perfection. It's about connection. Rosa entered through the back door, carrying a thermos of coffee and the moral authority of someone who'd watched this family tear itself apart and rebuild itself stronger. She'd volunteered to assist with the class, claiming that someone needed to document Elena's teaching methods for posterity. How many families have signed up for the real classes? Rosa asked, setting up a folding chair where she could observe without interfering. 12 for the first month, Miguel replied, including a mother-daughter pair, where the daughter married outside their culture and wants to reconnect with her grandmother's recipes. And a father-son team where the son came out last year and they're looking for neutral ground to rebuild their relationship. Elena felt her chest swell with pride and purpose. This was what she'd dreamed of during those sleepless nights after the housewarming party humiliation. Not revenge, but relevance. Not proving Stephanie wrong, but proving that love could triumph over fear in the most practical of ways. Isabella positioned herself behind the main camera, her young face serious with the responsibility of documenting family history. Whenever you're ready, abuela. Just pretend we're not here. Elena laughed. Mija, there's nowhere to hide in a kitchen. We might as well embrace being seen. She gathered her small class around the central prep station, where the largest Malkajit sat waiting. This one had belonged to her mother, carried from Jalisco in 1952, wrapped in newspaper and prayers. Its volcanic stone surface bore the marks of thousands of meals, countless moments of transformation. Before we begin cooking, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of generations, we're going to talk about why we're here, not just today, but in this family, in this life. Stephanie shifted nervously. Should I go first? We'll start with the food, Elena replied gently. Because the food always tells the truth. She guided them through the selection of chiles, explaining how each variety contributed not just flavor but personality to the mole. The ancho with its sweet complexity, the mulatto with its tobacco undertones, the chipotle that carried smoke like memory. David, Elena said, handing him a dried ancho, tell me what this smells like. David brought the chile to his nose, closing his eyes. It smells like Christmas morning when I was 8. Like the kitchen on Easter when you'd start cooking before sunrise. And why do you think that is? Because you used these chiles for celebrations, for the meals that mattered most. David's voice grew soft with realization. I'd forgotten that connection until just now. Elena nodded. Stephanie, what about you? What does this smell like to you? Stephanie hesitated, then inhaled deeply. It smells like possibility, like flavors I never learned to appreciate because I was too scared to try. And now? Now I want to understand. I want to learn the language you've been speaking my whole marriage, the one I was too proud to ask for translations. Elena felt Miguel's approving glance from across the kitchen. This was exactly what they'd hoped the classes could accomplish, not just teaching techniques, but creating space for honesty. As they moved through the process of toasting chiles and grinding spices, Elena shared stories she'd never told her family before. About her mother's fear when they first arrived in Los Angeles, speaking no English and knowing no one. About Roberto's shame when he couldn't find work that matched his education from Mexico. About the way food had become their anchor. The one thing that reminded them of who they'd been before immigration changed everything. I used to think your attachment to these recipes was about the past, David said as he worked his molcajete with increasing confidence. But it's really about the future, isn't it? About making sure the important things survive. Everything survives if it matters enough to someone, Elena replied. The question is, what matters enough to you to preserve it? Stephanie paused in her grinding. I never had anything that mattered enough before. My foster families changed too often, and I learned not to get attached to traditions that might disappear. But this. She gestured around the kitchen. This feels worth preserving. Isabella lowered her camera for a moment. Mom, what you just said, that's the most honest thing I've ever heard you say. Your mother is learning to speak a new language, Elena said, the language of belonging. It takes practice. As the mole began to take shape, the complex sauce requiring constant attention and adjustment, Elena watched her family settle into a rhythm they'd never found around a dinner table. David shared memories of helping her cook as a child, stories Stephanie had never heard. Stephanie talked about her fantasies of what family dinners should look like, dreams she'd never admitted to pursuing. Isabella documented it all, her teenage perspective capturing moments the adults might have missed. "The chocolate goes in now," Elena announced. "This is the moment that separates good mole from great mole." She demonstrated the technique: how to break the chocolate into pieces that would melt evenly, how to stir in one direction to prevent the sauce from breaking, how to taste and adjust until the balance was perfect. "Let David do this part," Stephanie said suddenly. "He should be the one to add the chocolate." Elena looked at her daughter-in-law with surprise. "Why?" "Because this is his heritage, his family's recipe. I want to learn it, but he should be the one to carry it forward." David's eyes filled with tears. "Steph, I'm not trying to take your place in this family," Stephanie continued, her voice steady despite her emotion. "I'm trying to find my own place, as someone who honors what came before, while helping build what comes next." Elena handed the wooden spoon to her son, watching as he took his position at the stove. The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubbling of the mole and the whir of Isabella's camera. "Stir slowly," Elena instructed. "Let the chocolate tell you when it's ready to integrate." David stirred with the concentration of prayer, his movements becoming more confident as muscle memory returned. The chocolate melted into the sauce, creating the deep, complex color that Elena's grandmother had called the brown of rich earth after rain. "Now taste," Elena said. David lifted a small spoonful, blew on it to cool it, then closed his eyes as he tasted, his face transformed with something like wonder. "It's perfect," he whispered. "It tastes exactly like childhood." "Let me try," Stephanie said. Elena watched as her daughter-in-law tasted the mole they'd created together. Stephanie's expression cycled through surprise, recognition, and something that looked like coming home. "I understand now," Stephanie said, "why you were so hurt by what I said. This isn't just food. It's love made tangible. It's your family's story told in flavors that can't be replicated by machines or shortcuts." Elena felt tears threaten. "And do you understand why I couldn't sell it to the corporation? Because some things are too precious to mass produce. Some stories are too important to let strangers tell." Miguel cleared his throat from his position near the stove. "If we're having family revelations, I have something to add." They all turned to him. Isabella adjusted her camera angle to capture whatever was coming. "My real name isn't Miguel Santos," he said quietly. "It's Miguel Hernandez." Stephanie gasped. "Hernandez?" "Carmen Hernandez was my grandmother. The foster family you lived with? That was us." The silence that followed was complete. Even the mole seemed to stop bubbling. "I remember you," Miguel continued, his voice gentle but firm. "The scared little girl who wouldn't eat my grandmother's pozole, who acted like our food wasn't good enough, like we weren't good enough." Stephanie's face went white. "Miguel, let me finish." His tone wasn't angry, just honest. "After you left, my grandmother stopped cooking special meals for foster kids. She said her heart couldn't take another rejection. She never got over the feeling that she'd failed you somehow." Tears streamed down Stephanie's face. "She didn't fail me. I failed her. I failed everyone." "But here's the thing," Miguel said, his expression softening. "Watching you learn to make mole today, seeing you honor the techniques my grandmother loved, I think she would forgive you. I think she'd be proud that you finally found your way to understanding what she was trying to give you." Elena reached for Stephanie's hand. "Miguel, why didn't you tell us this before?" "Because I needed to see if the change was real. If Stephanie was truly ready to honor our culture, instead of just performing acceptance." He looked directly at Stephanie. "But what I see today, the way you listen, the way you ask questions, the way you respect the process, this is real. This is the granddaughter my abuela always hoped you'd become." Stephanie covered her face with her hands, sobbing with a grief that had been 30 years in the making. Elena pulled her close, holding her as she cried for the love she'd rejected, the family she'd lost, the fear that had shaped so many of her choices. "We're going to name one of the classes after her," Elena said suddenly. "The Carmen Hernandez Memorial Cooking Class. For kids aging out of foster care, so they can learn to cook the foods that connect them to communities they want to join. Miguel's eyes lit up. Abuela would love that. And we're going to teach it together, Elena continued, looking at Stephanie. You and me, so other scared children can learn what you've learned, that belonging isn't about perfection. It's about showing up with an open heart. Elena wiped her hands on her apron, giving her granddaughter her full attention. What is it, Mija? When you first opened this place, you were angry, hurt. You wanted to prove that your food mattered. Elena nodded. That's true. But now? It's not about proving anything anymore, is it? It's about sharing. About creating space for other people to find what they're looking for. Elena looked around her restaurant, at the family sharing meals and stories, at Miguel patiently teaching a customer how to properly taste mole, at David and Stephanie working together to plan their next family class series, at Rosa greeting newcomers with the warmth of an old friend. You're right, Elena said. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about my pain and started being about everyone's healing. As the day wound down and the last customers lingered over their meals, Elena found herself in the kitchen with her molkajete, grinding spices for tomorrow's preparation. The volcanic stone felt familiar in her hands, worn smooth by generations of women who'd understood that cooking was an act of love, that feeding people was a way of changing the world one meal at a time. David joined her at the prep counter, picking up a knife to help with vegetable prep for the morning. Mom, I need to thank you. Elena looked up from her grinding. For what? For not giving up on us. For not letting my cowardice or Stephanie's fear destroy what we could become. Elena reached across the counter to touch her son's hand. Family isn't about being perfect, Mijo. It's about choosing each other, again and again, even when it's hard. Stephanie appeared beside them, carrying the last of the cleaned molkajitis from the family class stations. Especially when it's hard, she added quietly. Miguel emerged from the walk-in cooler with ingredients for tomorrow's specials. Isabella powered down her equipment after capturing the day's final moments, and Rosa counted the till with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped nurture something beautiful into existence. They stood together in the kitchen that had become the heart of their rebuilt family, surrounded by the tools and traditions that connected them to the past while pointing toward the future. What's next? Isabella asked, ever the documentarian looking for the next chapter of their story. Elena smiled, thinking of the cookbook they were writing together. Not just recipes, but healing narratives from the families who'd found connection in her kitchen. She thought of the cooking school inquiries they'd received, the requests to expand their family healing programs, the opportunity to teach other communities how to use food as a bridge to understanding. Whatever comes next, Elena said, we'll face it together. As a family. She looked around at these people who'd become her chosen family, each carrying their own stories of brokenness and healing, all bound together by the simple understanding that love was best expressed through the care taken in preparing a meal, the attention paid to preserving traditions, the courage required to keep choosing each other, despite imperfections. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet. Inside Abuela's kitchen, Elena Martinez cleaned her molcajete one final time, preparing it for tomorrow's possibility of transformation. The restaurant that had begun with rejection had become a place of acceptance. The recipes that had been dismissed as peasant food had become the foundation for profound healing. Elena turned off the lights and locked the door, carrying with her the satisfaction of someone who'd taken their deepest pain and transformed it into their greatest gift. Tomorrow would bring new families seeking connection, new stories waiting to be shared, new opportunities to prove that love, properly seasoned and patiently prepared, could overcome any bitterness life served up. The last course, Elena had learned, was never really the last. There was always another meal to share, another story to tell, another chance to choose love over fear. And she would be ready, molcajete in hand, to help anyone hungry enough to try. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote. As they cleaned up the kitchen together, the mole simmering gently for the final hour of cooking, Elena felt a completeness she hadn't experienced since Roberto's death. Her restaurant had become more than a business. It was a place where broken things could be made whole, where love could triumph over fear, where families could find their way back to each other through the simple act of cooking together. Isabella powered down her cameras with the satisfaction of someone who'd captured something historic. Abuela, this is going to be the most beautiful episode yet. Episode? Elena asked. Oh, didn't I tell you? Netflix wants to do a documentary series about the restaurant. About families healing through food. I told them we'd think about it. Elena looked around at her chosen family. David finding pride in his heritage. Stephanie learning to belong. Miguel honoring his grandmother's memory. Rosa documenting wisdom for future generations. Isabella bridging past and future with the fearlessness of youth. We'll think about it. Elena agreed. But first, we have our own story to finish writing. The mole was ready now, its complex flavors fully integrated, its color the deep brown of rich earth after rain. Elena ladled it into bowls for tasting, then added the final touch. A sprinkle of sesame seeds and a few drops of crema, the way her grandmother had taught her mother, who had taught her. They tasted in reverent silence, each spoonful carrying the weight of reconciliation and the promise of new traditions being born. To family, Elena said, raising her small bowl. To second chances, David added. To belonging, Stephanie whispered. To Carmen Hernandez, Miguel said firmly. To the future, Isabella declared. They touched their bowls together in a toast that felt like prayer, like forgiveness, like the beginning of something beautiful. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to another ordinary day. But inside Abuela's kitchen, a family had just chosen love over fear, understanding over judgment, and each other over everything else that might have divided them. The real healing, Elena knew, was just beginning. 6 months later, Elena stood in the kitchen of Abuela's kitchen at 5 a.m, but she wasn't alone. The soft murmur of Spanish and English voices filled the space as 3 generations worked side by side, preparing for another day of what had quietly become a neighborhood institution. Isabella, now graduated and deferring college for a gap year to document the restaurant's growing impact, moved between prep stations with her camera, capturing the organic choreography of her family at work. Her Netflix documentary, The Last Course, A Family's Recipe for Healing, had premiered the month before to critical acclaim, but more importantly, it had inspired hundreds of families to book their own cooking classes. Abuela, the sesame seeds are perfectly toasted. Miguel called from his station, where he supervised 2 new kitchen assistants, recent culinary school graduates who'd begged for the chance to learn traditional techniques from Elena herself. Good. Remember, they should smell like sunshine when they're ready. Elena smiled as she heard Miguel repeat her words to his students, the wisdom passing down another generation. David entered through the back door, carrying fresh marigolds from the flower market, and the organized energy of someone who'd found purpose beyond profit margins. His leave of absence from the marketing firm had become permanent when he realized that helping grow something meaningful was more satisfying than any corporate promotion. Morning, Mom. The Times photographer will be here at noon for the follow-up piece. And we have 3 families coming for private classes this week, including the Nguyen family who want to learn both Vietnamese and Mexican techniques to bridge their cultures. Elena nodded, stirring the mole that would simmer all day, developing the complex flavors that had become the restaurant's signature. And the Carmen Hernandez Memorial Class? 15 foster kids signed up for next Saturday's session. Stephanie's been working with the social workers to make sure we have translation services available. As if summoned by her name, Stephanie appeared from the dining room, carrying freshly polished molkajis and wearing the confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world. Her transformation over the past months had been remarkable, not just in her cooking skills, but in her ease with herself, her comfort in her own skin. The prep stations are ready, she announced, and I think we should add an extra table today. Rosa's bringing her neighbor's granddaughter. Apparently the girl's been begging to learn how to make her bisabuela's tamales. Elena felt the familiar warmth that came from watching her vision expand in ways she'd never imagined. What had begun as an act of defiance, a wounded woman's refusal to let her culture be dismissed, had evolved into something much larger. Abuela's kitchen had become a place where families came to heal, where traditions were preserved and honored, where the simple act of cooking together created bonds that transcended old hurts. The morning prep continued with the easy rhythm they'd developed over months of working together. Elena taught while she worked, sharing not just techniques but stories, context, the why behind every ingredient choice. Miguel translated her wisdom for the younger cooks, adding his own culinary school knowledge to her traditional methods. David managed the business side with the care of someone protecting something precious. Stephanie coordinated the family classes with the empathy of someone who understood how much courage it took to show up vulnerable in a kitchen full of strangers. Rosa arrived at 8, as she had every day since the restaurant opened, carrying her thermos of coffee and the moral authority of someone who'd watched this family tear itself apart and rebuild itself stronger. "How many for lunch today?" she asked, tying on her hostess apron. A position she'd accepted formally when it became clear that Elena's vision for the restaurant included making everyone feel like family. 37 reservations, plus walk-ins, David replied. And Carmen Rodriguez is bringing her editor from Food and Wine. They want to feature us in their sustainability issue. Elena paused in her stirring. Carmen had become not just a supporter but a friend, someone who understood the responsibility that came with preserving culinary traditions in a rapidly changing world. Her original review had launched their success, but her continued advocacy had helped them navigate growth without losing their soul. "Tell Carmen we'll have fresh pozole today," Elena said, in honor of all the homecomings. As the restaurant filled with the lunch crowd, Elena moved between kitchen and dining room, greeting regular customers by name, sharing the stories behind each dish with newcomers, watching families discover flavors that connected them to their own histories or introduced them to traditions they'd never known. At table 6, she watched a teenage boy taste her mole for the first time, his eyes closing in wonder as the complex flavors unfolded on his tongue. His parents, one Mexican-American, one Korean-American, had brought him here to explore his multicultural heritage through food. At table 12, an elderly woman ate Elena's pozole, with tears streaming down her face, explaining to her daughter that it tasted exactly like her own mother's recipe, which had been lost when the family scattered after immigration. At table 3, a young couple shared their first meal after a fight about wedding traditions, using Elena's food as neutral ground to discuss how to honor both their families' cultures in their celebration. These were the moments that made Elena's heart sing, not the recognition or the success, but the connections. The way food became a bridge between past and future, between cultures, between family members who'd lost their way to each other. Isabella approached her between tables, camera in hand but powered down for once. "Abuela, I've been thinking about something."